Welcome to the Gastro Girl podcast. We bring together patients, experts, and health advocates who are all here to help you optimize your health. Here's your host, Jacqueline Gaulin.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Gastro Girl podcast. We're joined today by the amazing registered dietitian Patsy Katsos, who has an expertise in IBS, FODMAPs, and a variety of digestive health conditions. She was our previous guest on the episode we did related to this, all about FODMAPs, basically a 101 overview. So if you're just starting out, not familiar with FODMAPs, we suggest you watch that episode because today's episode is all about tips and modifications for recipes and some exciting cooking techniques. Welcome, Patsy Katsos. So great to have you on again.
Yeah, it's nice to be back.
So again, if you're not familiar with what IBS is or FODMAPs, we suggest you watch these episodes and we'll put the links to them below. But basically, we're going to jump right in because I know our audience is so interested in how to make the transition and how to implement low FODMAP intervention and with some modifications, because that's always a big question. So give us, a sense of what we need to do to prepare ourselves with our pantries and in our cupboards. Like, what should we have on hand if we're going to start this dietary intervention?
Great question. So it does help to stop just for a quick moment to think about what FODMAPs are. There are certain sugars and certain fibers in food. Okay, so those are all under the umbrella of carbohydrates. That means that foods that don't have any carbohydrates in them, like meat, fish, poultry, eggs, and oils, don't have any FODMAPs either. So really, those are ingredients in your kitchen that can be used freely without regard to FODMAPs. Other foods, though, plant foods in general, tend to have a lot of FODMAPs in them. So when we're getting ready to make a meal or prepare a recipe that's got a lot of plant foods in it, we have to think about how we're going to manage that. And the problem is that many cooking and baking staples are really rich in FODMAPs. For example, flour is a big source of, flour that's made from wheat in particular is a big source of FODMAPs, specifically fructans. Milk is not a plant food. Obviously, it's, maybe not so obviously, but dairy milk is not a plant food, but it's got a lot of lactose in it, and lactose is one of the FODMAPs. So, right away, flour and milk are things that have to be addressed for low FODMAP cooking. And along with that, many fruits and vegetables and onions and garlic, of course, which are famously used in many, many recipes, are key high FODMAP ingredients.
So, Patsy, if you were working with me as your client, what would the strategies that you would tell me, firsthand, like I'm sitting in your office or I'm on the telehealth and I'm, oh my God, I don't know if I could do this. What would you tell me? Like, how do I strategically implement this under your guidance?
Right. Well, the first thing would be to really think about building recipes around lower FODMAP ingredients. So, instead of having pasta, bread, sandwiches, pizza, things that revolve around wheat, you're going to probably want to plan your meals more around rice and potatoes and other naturally low FODMAP foods. That would be like the overall approach. But when it comes to making certain recipes, you have to think about strategy-wise, like what are you going for? Are you trying to follow a low FODMAP phase of a strict elimination diet? If so, you're going to need to modify the recipes more and make bigger changes. But if you're just trying to cut back on your FODMAP intake, that's okay too. In that case, you just use less of certain high FODMAP ingredients.
So let's take us through the phases, because that's a really important point. Eliminating, like with the elimination phase. How do we make this as painless as possible for clients, for patients? when they're thinking about a strategy for the elimination phase, what are your top tips?
Right. So first we have to remember the FODMAP elimination diet process has 3 steps. The low FODMAP phase is only step 1, and we want to keep it short. We want to have good resources, to help us know what serving sizes of foods are low FODMAP. And, then we want to move on to the reintroduction process after just a few weeks. So I usually recommend using the Monash Low FODMAP app, and that has very detailed information about, how much of each food can be considered low FODMAP.
So how can I tell if a recipe is the right candidate for the low FODMAP part of my diet here?
Well, have a look at the ingredients that are called for in the recipe and choose a recipe that isn't all about wheat products, onions, garlic, beans. Those recipes are going to be difficult to modify because the essential nature of the recipe involves an ingredient that you can't eat very much of or at all on low FODMAP diet. So for example, French onion soup is not going to be a good candidate for modification because, onions are a no-go. A big bowl of bean soup is not going to be a good candidate for modification. But a recipe that only has, a small amount of beans in it might be doable. So you take a look at the recipe, you see which of those ingredients that it calls for are rich in FODMAPs, and you try to figure out, what their functions are in the recipe. For example, if there's a little bit of flour in a recipe and it's used as a thickener, it would be relatively easy to choose a low FODMAP thickener like cornstarch to replace that wheat flour with and then go on with the recipe more or less as written. Same with onions and garlic to a point. If their function in the recipe is to season it, you can often redirect the flavor profile of the recipe in another direction and choose other things to season it with.
So, not a lot of people can probably look at a label and say a recipe and say that something has a lot high FODMAP. So what do you recommend? Is it the app? Do they go to a website to look up, if it's a high FODMAP food, how do you recommend folks do that?
Well, one thing you can do is try to find recipes that have already been modified by somebody else to reduce their FODMAP content. For example, FODMAPeveryday.com is an online source for low FODMAP recipes that are already ready and waiting for you. That makes it a lot easier. I think many people would like to know a little bit more about how to modify their own family favorite recipes. And that is a little bit trickier, isn't it? So for that, it's a kind of a mechanical process. You just have to sit down with your recipe on one side and your Monash Low FODMAP app on the other and, review each ingredient and think about, whether your serving size, your portion of the recipe is going to be low enough in FODMAPs or not. For example, say the recipe makes 4 servings. And it calls for a certain amount of bell peppers. You have to think about, if I eat 1/4 of this recipe, that means I'm going to be eating, 2 tablespoons of bell peppers. And then you look in your app to see if that's a suitable low FODMAP serving size.
And if it's not, maybe just cut it down a little bit.
Yeah. Many times ingredients can be just omitted. That doesn't work in baking at all. But in cooking, if you're making a salad or a casserole, you can often just completely leave out an ingredient that you don't want to eat, or you can replace it with another similar ingredient. Typically, vegetables can be exchanged for each other. Herbs and spices can be exchanged for each other. Solids for solids, liquids for liquids. That works very well, except in baking.
Now, what about a powdered form of something, like say onion powder or garlic infused oils? Is that still considered a high FODMAP food, or does that help reduce the FODMAP content in those things?
Well, that's a really good question. So one thing to know about FODMAPs is that they are water soluble, not oil soluble. So infused oils are a great way to get the flavor of something like garlic without the FODMAPs. But drying and dehydrating things doesn't have the same effect. So if we know that the original food like onion or garlic is high in FODMAPs, so will the dehydrated or dried version of the food. In fact, sometimes they even have more FODMAPs in them.
Oh, wow. Good thing we asked that question. So let's go back to baking, because a lot of our listeners probably love to bake. What are some of the low FODMAP flours that could be substitute, for instance?
Well, the gluten-free flours tend to be lower in FODMAPs than the gluten-containing flours. We know that gluten is not a FODMAP, so it's not the gluten per se. It's just kind of a helpful coincidence that those grains tend to be lower in FODMAPs. So you will probably be avoiding using the gluten grain flours such as wheat, barley, and rye, but you could use buckwheat, rice, sorghum, corn flour, or cornmeal, as we call it here in the States. Those are all really great baking ingredients.
And what about like milks? Like the nut milks and things like that.
Well, nutrition considerations aside, because they tend to be kind of low in nutrition, they can often be substituted effectively in baking for milk. They're a little lower in protein, so recipes that really rely a lot on the protein content of the liquid don't come out quite as well with that substitution, in my view. For example, custards, eggs, and milk are the main ingredients in a custard, and I don't think they come out particularly well with milk alternatives like almond milk or coconut milk. But as far as using a liquid in, baking, other kinds of baking, they're good substitutes.
Oh, wow. Now, what are your other suggestions for like spices and things like that?
So spices are a great way to amp up the flavor of recipes without the FODMAPs, because all the leafy herbs, whether they're fresh or dried, all the spices other than onion and garlic do tend to be very low in FODMAPs and in the amounts usually consumed. So you might be wanting to kind of up your game when it comes to using herbs and spices. Sometimes I get feedback from readers that, it's that fresh herbs can be difficult to find. They can be expensive, and I can really feel this too. Sometimes you buy a big bunch of something and you only use part of it for one recipe, and then the rest of it, is either wasted or spoils. So it's handy to know how to substitute dried herbs and spices for the fresh ones. Have you ever done that in your kitchen? Tried to substitute?
Yeah, sometimes they have the little ones. If I can't find like parsley, for instance, fresh parsley, or it looks not so great, they have something in a little cup. Have you seen it in the grocery store?
Like pre-chopped.
Yeah. And that it's okay. I mean, nothing compares to, in my opinion, the fresh stuff, but I've tried to use those things before.
Okay. And sometimes people want to just reach into their spice cupboard and use dried parsley instead of fresh parsley and go one step further. And that can work pretty well as long as the entire recipe is not about the fresh herbs.
Right.
So for example,
like a pesto or something where you have to chop all those beautiful...
Those things that have loads of fresh basil or fresh parsley, you're not going to be able to pull that off with the dried substitute. But if it's a salad dressing or a casserole or a saute, you definitely can. And the rule of thumb is usually to use about a teaspoon of dried herbs to replace a tablespoon of fresh ones. And that rule of thumb works pretty well.
I love lemon, like squeezing fresh lemon. It's amazing what lemon could do to pretty much any food, like broccoli or salad. Like I just love lemon. I mean, is that okay on the FODMAP diet?
Absolutely. You're not kidding. That really brightens up the flavor of food tremendously. And thank goodness, fresh lemon juice and fresh lime juice are relatively low in FODMAPs, as are vinegars. So those are things that can really perk up the flavor quite a bit.
I love to put squeeze fresh lemon on, I don't use a lot of salt, like heavy on salt, but lemon, like on a chicken soup, is just fantastic.
Yes, it is delicious. That's kind of a secret weapon for chicken soup.
And my grandmother, the Italian grandmother always had the tricks, and she would put that lemon, and then of course some freshly grated Parmesan cheese. Sometimes it was delicious.
Yes, sounds great. Fresh ginger is another really killer ingredient that will perk up any kind of Asian themed recipe. And it's not as expensive as it seems, because you only need a little bit, and you don't have to buy that whole huge can that you see in the grocery store. Sometimes it's actually okay to just snap off a little bit, and it might just cost 30 or 40 cents and make a huge difference in the flavor of your recipe.
Speaking of ginger, I love ginger ale, but I don't like the diet stuff, and I don't like to buy the so much sugar or corn syrup. I haven't tried this yet, but I was wondering what you thought about. It's homemade ginger ale, and the recipe had ginger was one. I think a little bit of maple syrup. Is that a high FODMAP food?
Not in the amount it would take to lightly sweeten.
Yeah, because you don't need a lot. And I think there was a couple other things, but it also had sparkling, like water.
Yeah,
and it's not. I got to find the recipe. I think
sounds like fun.
Yeah. So, what are some of the other more common tips like you had? I know there's, you want to replace solids for solids, liquids for liquids. Is that pretty much a standard recommendation?
Except for baking, yes.
For baking, man. Yeah. I'm not a baker. I hate following directions.
Those are probably top tips. Another few ingredients that can really help you take the flavor profile in a little different direction would be to use the green parts of alliums. So even though the bulbs of onions, green onions, leeks, and so on have more FODMAPs, the green parts are relatively low in FODMAPs. So you can substitute those and just, slice up the bulbs and offer them to some person at your table that doesn't have to limit their FODMAP intake.
Now, we've heard the term stacking. What is that?
Well, stacking refers to the fact that with FODMAPs, you have to think about the whole meal, the effect of the whole meal you're going to consume. And so it's theoretically possible that, if you have too many moderate serving sizes of FODMAP containing foods, that eventually the whole meal could turn out to be high in FODMAPs. For example, smoothies.
Oh, right.
If you fill the entire blender with, low FODMAP serving sizes of 5 or 6 different kinds of fruit and so on, and then you consume the whole thing, you could end up eating a lot more FODMAPs than you can handle at one sitting. So that's stacking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you just don't, because that makes sense, because we tend to put all the different fruits. Then we may put some, flaxseed, ground flaxseed, and then you have some kind of juice, some people, or a milk or an almond milk. And then if you're using a protein powder or something else, you could have a real big FODMAP problem.
Right. So, avoiding it in recipes is a little bit of an art. We don't have a way to calculate the total FODMAP content of a recipe using the resources that are available to us as consumers. So my advice would be to make sure that each ingredient in the recipe sticks to one low FODMAP serving size. So the principle is that if every single ingredient in the in the meal, it is green or low FODMAP, as shown in the low FODMAP app, that the meal will be too. And, if you feel like your recipe might really be pushing the limits, you just can make sure that you eat that recipe for the entire meal, and make sure that if there are any additional foods that you're eating with that they're especially low in FODMAPs.
Right. And that applies to, having, a meal. Like, it's like, what is each thing on your plate? And that brings up a good point, because we don't want to make people, oh my God, this is so daunting. And that's why I think what you said in your earlier episode about going through the elimination phase to figure out what really triggers your symptoms, because not every FODMAP is going to respond to everyone the same. So you don't want to be taking all this stuff out of your diet and potentially setting yourself up for eating disorders, or something like, depleting yourself of nutrients because you're eliminating so much.
Right. And thank you for that. And the other thing is that, if we're keeping the low FODMAP phase as short as possible, you might actually not have to face recipe cooking to any great extent. In fact, while this makes a really interesting topic for a podcast, most people for, a 2 or 3 week dietary experiment can just eat really simply. If you have a piece of baked chicken and a baked potato and, a low FODMAP serving of vegetables on your plate, that's a good low FODMAP meal. Doesn't require a lot of thought, no modification there, just making appropriate food choices. And, you can use some of the tips we talked about for minimal seasoning of your baked chicken, or what to put on your vegetables or potato, and just keep it simple. A lot of these things we've talked about today would be, considered more advanced low FODMAP skills.
Yeah. And that brings me, and I know that you've been involved, and some of our other dietitians, as, such great and important roles that you've had in companies that do low FODMAP meals. And, we don't, how do you feel about those? And are they something that's helpful for patients?
They really can be. I mean, some people prefer and are really skilled at doing their own cooking, and they have the time to do so. But where those prepared, so Modify Health is the company that I am a consultant to. I consult to them about mostly their low FODMAP product line, helping them make sure that the meals are low FODMAP, and helping them with the certification process, because all of their meals are certified by Monash as low FODMAP. But anyway, I think that, the idea with those meals is that they offer a very convenient way to be compliant with the requirements of the low FODMAP diet during the low FODMAP phase. And then, you can keep eating them during the reintroduction process too, to make sure that your baseline diet is really low FODMAP. And, they probably cost more than cooking from scratch, but less than eating out and eating a lot of takeout, which many people are used to relying on. So they definitely can play a role.
No, that's great. I think that's important for our listeners, so that they know there are options out there. And again, you don't just want to start going low FODMAP just randomly because you don't want to avoid, make sure you're getting the right nutrients. So going through the first phase, second phase, third phase, and we explained this in our previous episode, is really important. And working with a dietitian. It's not like you have to work with a dietitian every day, but they can really give you and set you up for success. So don't be afraid of that. I think that's so key. Now let's have some fun, Patsy. Let's play recipe modification.
Okay.
Okay. So, what do we like? So how about something like pizza? Everybody likes pizza. There's many ways to make pizza. There's cauliflower crust. There's, our own crust. Like we go and there's different toppings, cheeses. So how would you modify or suggest, making a homemade pizza?
Okay. Well, pizza is a tall order because every part of the pizza is potentially high in FODMAPs.
That's why I picked it.
Yeah. So it's a good challenge. If I were going to try to make a low FODMAP pizza, I would probably purchase a gluten-free pizza crust. Again, not because it's the gluten that we're trying to limit, because gluten is not a FODMAP, but it's going to be made with other types of flour that are low in FODMAPs compared to regular all-purpose or bread flour. So we'd maybe start with a gluten-free pizza crust, and then you would probably have to use a plain tomato product, like maybe just plain crushed tomatoes, rather than a pizza sauce that has onion and garlic in it. And you could use something real simple, like right out of the can, in a low FODMAP serving size, or you could make your own on the stovetop with garlic infused oil and some fresh herbs or dried herbs. So that would be the sauce. And then for vegetable toppings, you'd make sure that you didn't choose onion and garlic, but you could maybe do some, and you're going to have to skip the mushrooms too, but you could do some like chopped, pre-cooked broccoli. I like broccoli on my pizza, and some bell peppers, something simple like that. And maybe if you like meat, you could do some plain cooked ground beef for a little meatiness. And then you can use cheese, because cheese is relatively low FODMAP, even the kind made with milk. And that would be a pretty decent pizza. Some Parmesan, some mozzarella, yummy.
So that's great. Thanks for those tips. So I think most people love those bowls, whether you're plant-based eater or maybe you like chicken or meat on your bowl. How could we create a bowl that would be nutritious and meet your low FODMAP requirements, so that our tummies aren't all upset? What do you recommend? What would be a great bowl? And you can alter it for a vegan or a vegetarian and someone that likes other protein sources.
Bowls really are awesome because they're so flexible. So you'd want to have usually a grain in a bowl, right? So I would probably go with low FODMAP grains like white rice, brown rice, or quinoa. Those would be good starts. And then for the protein, you could have any kind of simple or seasoned with only low FODMAP ingredients, baked or shredded chicken, beef, pork. If you're going to use beans, you're going to have to go easy on them, because only a couple tablespoons of canned drained beans are low FODMAP. You might want to use tofu if you're a vegetarian or vegan for the protein in your bowl, because those firm tofu is low FODMAP. And of course, you can pre-season that too. You could roast that ahead of time with oil and whatever seasonings you prefer. So now you've got your grain, your protein, and you just have to, add some vegetables that are lowish in FODMAPs. Look, most of the salad vegetables are low FODMAPs. So you could do greens, you could do cucumbers, bell peppers, a few cherry tomatoes, or like a small round tomato. And that brings us up to the dressing or sauce on the bowl. And you just have to think about what kind of flavor profile you're going for. Oil and vinegar are always good, basic low FODMAP ingredients. A couple tablespoons of sour cream is low FODMAP. Mayonnaise is low FODMAP. So, I would maybe check into some low FODMAP salad dressings that other people have developed, or experiment with making your own.
That's great. Well, I'm going to turn this over to you, because I have no idea, what I would want to bake. So let's pick a dessert. What is your favorite FODMAP, low FODMAP dessert that you would recommend and that's easy to make?
Probably brownies. And the reason they're a good candidate is that they have very little flour in them in the first place. They're mostly, butter, chocolate, and eggs. So that kind of recipe is a really good candidate for a low FODMAP version. If you substitute some gluten-free flour in the brownie recipe, it's going to pass really well. People probably won't even know it's low FODMAP.
So Patsy, it's low FODMAP. So that kind of there's no portion thing, right? So we could that sets us up to eat more than our portion size. So I'm just kidding.
You bring up a good point there. Even recipes that have been modified for to be low in FODMAPs you do have to respect the portion size, because portions are always part of the game with FODMAPs, right? And that's how we prevent stacking, by making sure that the portion that you consume, not the whole recipe, is low in FODMAPs. So yes, you have to pay attention to that.
Well, and just in our general health and wellness, right? We can't be eating whole pans of low FODMAP brownies. That's another episode.
I do have 2 blog posts on ibsfree.net that go into all the nuts and bolts of low FODMAP baking.
Oh, that's awesome.
So Lisa was my co-author on IBS-free recipes for the whole family. And she is a really experienced and expert low FODMAP baker.
This is a great book. This is a cookbook. Is this available on your website and Amazon?
It's available on Amazon.com. And Lisa is an expert low FODMAP baker, very experienced. And she teaches in great detail how to do your own low FODMAP baking mixes.
Well,
And
that's great.
you can read a lot more about the individual suitable low FODMAP baking ingredients and how to use them.
Well, this is fantastic. We could go on and talk about tons of recipes, but we're out of time. Really appreciate your guidance and insight today. As always, we are so grateful for your participation. We're going to put some links to the book, to her website, as well as to our previous episode, which kind of lays the groundwork for low FODMAP and implementing the low FODMAP diet. Thank you, Patsy, and have a great day.
You too. Thanks for having me, and I'll see you next time.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to the Gastro Girl podcast. For more information and resources, please visit gastrogirl.com. Do you have a question for Gastro Girl? Please email podcast@gastrogirl.com. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in the Gastro Girl podcast are not a substitute for medical advice from your healthcare professional. Please consult a licensed clinician in your state